So, as we talk about value, what we're actually talking about is the inherent shade on a subject matter that is, of course, affected by this situation that it stands in regarding light. In light and dark, value just simply refers to light and dark, and it's only because of the changes of light that we can actually see value. Light always does reveal form. Achromatic grays is simply a term that's referred to as no color value or no color gray. Whenever we see chroma, we mean color. Whenever we put an A at the front of something, we mean it is absent of it. What you see at the bottom here is a value scale, and it's a value scale only with 7 values. I generally tell my students anywhere from 9 to 12 values are sufficient to be able to render. Typically, we kind of err more on the 9 side. 14 is a very, very, very intricate drawing. Right in the center there is essentially basically this medial value. It ultimately measures the relative lightness or darkness of a surface or a space. When we think about something like value contrast, what we're referring to is the shading contrast. And those things should be typically a full range. And that relationship will allow us to be able to differentiate and understand a space. So whenever we see value, we can typically identify maybe 40 of them with our eyes. To be able to actually render them, though, maybe about 9. The term low value can be used when we're thinking about essentially the contrast between any two areas that are next to each other that is very, very little. Specifically, the area that is on that doorway from the wall to the seam on the plane that closes the door itself. Value and color are intrinsically related. Every single color has a value, i.e., your basic cadmium red is going to situate itself right on the middle of a value scale. If white is number 1 and black is number 9. If you take all of the color out, then you don't get any value. Yellow generally is a high value color, so that'll be like a number 2 if number 1 is white. And then purple is generally a low value color that would lend itself well to being something like a dark gray. A value pattern is the way we use that contrast, as a means to play with differentiating forms. So what we're seeing here is a very violent image painted by Artemisia Gentileschi during the late Renaissance, the Baroque really, that ultimately allows us to be able to read a space even though it is very, very dark. We have 2 different keys that we can refer to in the value scheme. Low key is when all of the values are dark, and high key refers to all of the values being light. The image that you're looking at here is a high key image. Even though there are some dark areas, the vast majority lend themselves well to being very, very high on the value scale. Chromatic grays are simply just colored grays. And colored grays in basic color theory are typically mixed using complements, but we'll get to that when y'all take painting. The tones are mixing 2 contrasting colors that can achieve a hint of color itself. When we're rendering value, though, there's actually a lot to look for when we're thinking about the anatomy of the way light deals with a form. On the sphere below, we see quite a few things. The highlight, a transitional light or middle core value, the reflective light that's bouncing back up from the table, and then the cast shadow itself. I think that this cast shadow is poorly rendered because the edge of a cast shadow is generally going to be kind of soft. So the cast shadow that's in the cube, there is going to be an anatomy to a cast shadow as well. The core value, the cast shadow itself, the ambient light that's going to affect the way the edges of that shadow transition into a space. So that's much more accurate. We generally do not end a cast shadow with the line that is in that example, but there are seriously many dimensions to a value that one needs to consider when we're thinking about edge and when we're thinking about transitions and gradients. Gradients will be your friend. There are lots of techniques that we can approach, and we talked a lot about those in a couple lectures ago regarding application of surface. So blending, most of you will be doing that. Hatching, I do a lot of hatching on top of a blended surface because I like activating a surface. Cross hatching is a little bit more rigid and lends itself well more to ink, pen and nib. Stippling, same thing. Gradation, modeling and shading. Modeling and shading just ultimately follow the contour of a form itself. It's also something that I'll refer to as a technique, shading as a technique. Value can be used as a means to create emphasis, to lead the eye so that we understand a focal point. So the very, very high key, high contrast fish that's jumping out of the water is incredibly high contrast compared to the landscape it situates itself in. So it's easy to determine what I'm looking at, not only because of the activity, the shape, the diagonal, the movement, and the directionality and placement of that, but also because of the value itself, because the values surrounding that are ultimately darker. So if we think about contrast, ultimately it can be our friend in allowing ourselves to create a much more compelling composition. Chiaroscuro, or chiaro meaning light and scuro meaning dark in Italian, basically just implies sincere depth. Usually those forms are kind of really high contrast, very developed volumes that are generally coming out of a fairly dark space. But the term is a kind of all-encompassing umbrella term that really refers to the development of the forms themselves as being high contrast, fairly tightly rendered, and really indicating a lot of sincere detail in terms of the structure itself. Atmospheric or aerial perspective is generally when we see things in the far, far distance. They get a lot less distinctive. They get a lot lower in contrast. In color, they generally get a lot bluer. Warm pops and cool recedes. That's something you'll hear again and again when we're thinking about color theory. But the highest value or the highest contrast are the things that are going to appear to be in your immediate foreground. The middle ground and the background ultimately diminute, become not only smaller, but also less rendered and much more simplistic in terms of their description regarding value itself. Shading is just simply referred to as a technique, and every single medium that you use can be applied as a kind of shading approach. We'll talk about that later in the lecture. Whatever medium you use should be considered in terms of both the limitations and the possibilities. So we've got an example here of cross-hatching and wash drawing. This would be referred to as a mixed media piece. The cross-hatching is done on top of the wash drawing that is ultimately probably a walnut ink. Brown ink in the Renaissance, the late Renaissance, is generally derived from walnuts. Visual grays are something that we generally see when we're thinking about pixelation. Way back when, we would see these in newspapers and in books and magazines, because if you look very, very, very closely, it is essentially a series of dots, generally referred to as bende dots, as a means to make a photographic image. But these things, the eye perceptually mixes, and though you understand it close up as just a series of dots, the eye makes sense of it the further away you get. Plastic value is generally used when value is describing a volume and a space. Here we have two examples. We have decorative value that's used as a kind of application of pattern. We understand these things as separate entities from one to the next. Then we have amorphous value or open value. Those are values that cross over shape boundaries into other areas. The sort of blending technique of Gerhard Richter's work is a really good place for where we see that. Then we have closed value. These are very, very limited, and they end on the edge of a shape. Value patterns, it's the direction or pattern of light in dark in a composition. And it's usually used in order to sort of move the eye around the picture plane itself. Local value is probably the most important thing that you will learn in drawing class regarding value. It is the relative lightness or darkness of a surface seen in an objective world. Every single subject that you look at has a local value, meaning the overall value. If it's red, that value, the dominant value, is going to be a number 5 on the value scale. All of the indications of value, though, the rendering that goes within that, so the highlights and the dark and the core values of that red, that's referred to as specific value. So they're two very, very different things. So when working in black and white, you have to consider the lightness and darkness of the color of the subject you are actually drawing. If I am a Caucasian, my local value of my flesh tone might be a number 2 or 3. If I'm wearing a brown shirt, that local value of that shirt is probably going to be a number 7, right? And the folds and the specificity of that value is rendered at a later phase of the drawing stages. So if you take a black and white photo of a still life, everything is going to have its own respective local value. It's best generally to indicate that local value first to cover everything rather than to jump right into specific value. The biggest failing of every Drawing 1 student is to jump right into specific value without taking into consideration and applying the local value of the entirety first. You can observe local value very easily, especially in this image. The light shining across the board, the chalkboard, and the wall here ultimately tell you that the local value itself is very different from one to the next. You can see that the buildings rendered in this drawing, this is an ink drawing, are very distinctly different from one to the next because they are respectively very different colors, thus very different values. Chromatic value is simply just a colored value, so it's the relative lightness and darkness of a color as it relates to especially local value. And then, of course, achromatic value is just the black and white, the absence of color. High key and low key, we've got examples here. Highlight, it's the part of an object or surface which receives the greatest amount of direct light. One of the second biggest failings of a beginning drawing student is that they think that there's a ton of white and a ton of black in the world. Not so much. We actually very, very rarely see a number 1 on the value scale and a number 9 on the value scale. It's generally the in-betweens that we really need to focus on. So, there are expressive uses of value, especially conceptual. We can think about drama if we use high contrast in those values. If we use a very, very bright image with very, very light values, obviously that can be sort of very buoyant and very happy. Dark values are typically associated with the somber. And then the sort of subjective use of value can be dreamlike. It really depends on what it is you're trying to accomplish. This relates to, at least the formal understanding of value, relates directly to Gestalt. Gestalt, the thing that you need to remember is the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. So it's how these elements come together for us to make sense of them. So no matter how well you render a grape, the reality is the entirety of the still life itself matters much more and much more greatly than the grape itself. I think Chuck Close is a really good example of that. This is actually an airbrush painting of a self-portrait that he did in the late 70s, early 80s. He spent his entire career doing these massive portraits using value as a means to construct these kind of epic photorealist images. This is done entirely with thumbprints. And this portrait is done entirely with torn paper pieces. So to get a little bit closer. And this piece is done entirely with a grid system and paint, acrylic paint. And I work a lot with value right now. For the last year and a half or two, I've actually just worked in ink wash as a medium on paper and really sort of done a deep dive into understanding depth and form and the sort of pictorial construction as it relates to found images that I reconstruct, reassemble, and then remake through painting. I also deal with this sort of dichotomous relationship conceptually with value. If we're thinking about high contrast, we can also think about polarities. I'm dealing a lot with gender at this point in time in my studio practice, in pairing, serendipitously pairing sort of antiquated images of masculine and feminine, or at least traditionally associated masculine and feminine images from the Hollywood Golden Era, and various sources in order to construct a sort of renewed sort of Franken body. And as I play with these, I'm really sort of pushing the depths of what ink wash can actually do, because as you know, ink wash is not really erasable. So once a mistake is made, it's committed to. So here's an install shot of those and what they look like. And I'm really approaching it from the perspective of this sort of binary. And inkwash, for me, conceptually, really does fit within this notion of the binary, because it's, it's very much one or the other. But really what I'm much more interested in is the everything in between, especially as it relates to the projection of traditional masculinity or traditional femininity as being sort of insulting and absurd. So here are two more images. And that is my lecture on value.